So the thing that I want to do is talk about the challenges for the sector and some of the what I see as the emergent opportunities. Now, that's not necessarily the immediate opportunities, that is the next 6 months, the next year. We actually have to think very long term about housing, because what we put on the ground is here for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And then I want to talk, in a sense, reinforce what Scott said about what some of the things that we need to do, and there's certainly some of the things that Haven Housing are already doing. So the obvious point to make is that the community housing sector operates in a context of enormous policy uncertainty. There is no housing policy in Australia, either at the Commonwealth level or the state government level. And that means, if by default, there is no social housing policy if there is no national housing policy. But more importantly, in a number of the states, the management of housing is embedded in human service departments. And that's an enormous problem for us, because that, in a sense, shapes a philosophy about what we think the role of housing is. And some of us with long histories can remember when we had large housing commissions. Then they were reduced to departments of housing and planning. Then they became the Office of Housing. And then they became embedded in the Department of Human Services and have disappeared. There's not even the broom cupboard of housing. There's just nothing. That says something about where the status of housing, social housing is, but more generally of housing in Victoria, lost somewhere in the Department of Health and Human Services, with a particular philosophy about what housing is about. And that's, to me, one of the second challenges. The community sector has absorbed something of the philosophy that has dominated Commonwealth and state government thinking about the social housing sector for the last 20 years. And that is, basically, social housing is welfare housing, catering to the most severely disadvantaged. And if you have that philosophy, that means that the role of the sector just has to narrow to a residual role catering for those groups. That is not what community housing or social housing is about in any other country. It is we that have reduced it to that limited role. And we have to get out of it. And that is a big challenge for the community sector. Because while it's a cocktail of housing organisations with different business and management models, and that can be harnessed for the good, it is also a problem, because it means that there's tension and conflicts within the community sector about what is the most appropriate role for the community sector. Should it be just or should housing associations be organisations that are essentially just exit points for the homeless? Or should be there organisations that grow to become affordable housing agencies for moderate to lower income households that can't access appropriate and affordable housing in the private rental market, what I call the market failure model as distinct from the welfare model. And I think we've got to try and convince both ourselves, but more importantly government, to get out of this welfare model thinking. The other obvious point to make is it's a broken funding model. The funding models that we had were designed for a different social housing system and a different era, and we need to move on. But we've still got to operate within that one. Two immediate challenges, and Scott alluded to one of them, which is transfers. I actually think transfers will become the case in Victoria. The scale of it, I'm not certain, but I think we will emulate the other states and move to some transfers. And the other program initiative, which is very recent, is the Common Housing Register, which is a process whereby housing associations in particular, not necessarily all the community sector, but particularly the housing associations, share a common application and allocation system with the Office of Housing. There's just essentially one wait list. That has enormous potential or benefits, particularly for applicants. It streamlines the applicant process. But social housing agencies that participate in it have got to be aware that there's going to be problems and have to monitor how that's going to be implemented. Now, that's some of the challenges. There are others, but I can't talk about them all. Let's talk to some of the opportunities that I think are emergent. While I sounded negative about the state government and Commonwealth government, we do have new state governments and effectively a new Commonwealth government. Well, it's really a change of leadership, but in many respects it's a new Commonwealth government because they already are showing signals of lowering their ideological blinkers and beginning to recognise that there are major problems that they have to deal with. So both at the Commonwealth state government level, there is, and the Commonwealth Minister signalled this at the National Housing Conference in Perth, there is awareness that we do have a major affordability problem in Australia. So it's not just an issue of a problem for those most severely disadvantaged. That is a huge breakthrough for the Commonwealth to even acknowledge that. And the state government, I think, is already aware of that, but the challenge is to get them out of that narrow welfare thinking model. I think that can be done, but it'll take time. Scott also alluded to what I consider the windows of funding opportunity. There are two factors operating here. The first, we're back in a funding environment that existed way back in the 1940s and 50s when the public housing system was created. Historically, we have not had such low interest rates as back then, both private and public. And that opens up the potential for borrowing and growing the community sector if we can harness some of that finance. But harnessing that finance will require a different thinking about what is the appropriate role for the community sector, and I'll come back to that. And I think the second important one, and Tim Pallas, the State Treasurer, has already made some references to that, as has the Premier, but also the Prime Minister has made some references to this, and that is the recognition for the first time in 20 years that not all government borrowing is bad. We've had this ideology that government borrowing is bad. Private borrowing is good, public borrowing is bad. But that's beginning to break down, which opens up the opportunity for the idea of floating housing bonds and funding the growth of a community sector through housing bonds. If we can convince them that those bonds can be repaid by an income stream in the same way as the other sorts of infrastructure that can be funded by such bonds, such as roads, railways, etc. So I think we are at a situation where the funding environment potentially will change, and we've got to be in there to capitalise on that. A third obviously point to make is that the policy environment around housing is changing greatly. And Scott alluded to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which does open up new possibilities for the community sector. But I actually think in the longer term, we've also got a new issue, which is refugee settlement. I actually believe that the state of the world and the issues it's going to confront in the next 10 to 20 years is going to greatly increase the number of refugees that a country like Australia will have to settle. We did it back with the Vietnamese migrants in the 1970s, and if we remember back to then, the public housing system played a very important role in that settlement process. So I think there's a forthcoming important role for the social housing sector in Australia to also play a role in refugee settlement. Another opportunity, which is one which is I've already alluded to, but that is the problem of market failure. We shouldn't see that as an opportunity. But what that alludes to is that the scale of the affordability problem in Australia is becoming so great that it is slowly becoming a political issue. And what that enables us to do is to leverage off that as a political issue and to push the barrow of the community sector as a solution to that. Finally, at least on the ones I want to talk about, is in Victoria just the scale of need. Now, Scott also alluded to this, but you just have to reflect on the Department of Planning's projections for Victoria. And I find this hard to come to grips with myself, but in 2050, Victoria is going to have something like an estimate of 10 million people. This is 3 million additional households, not 3 million additional people. This is 3 million additional households compared to the current, it's 3 million households additional compared to the current 2 million. So it's actually 1 million households that we have to find dwellings for over the next 30 so years, which is not a long time period in the history of housing. 1 million households, if you actually think of it, for every household there has to be a dwelling. So that's 1 million dwellings. And we know from the last 20 to 30 years, something like 10.6%, 11%, 12%. I'm throwing in a fact here because I was told to throw in some facts. Encouraged to put in some facts. That around 10 to 12% of all those households will be in poverty and therefore, by definition, unable to afford market housing. Now, if you just think about that, that represents 100,000 dwelling units that are needed outside of the private market. Now, where are they going to look for that? Well, our argument would be the community sector has got to put the case that we need at least 100,000 dwelling units in Victoria. Right, so they're the opportunities, a changing external environment. But what are the challenges in terms of, or what are the things that we have to do to harness the opportunities? And I've alluded to one of them, which is we have to recast how we think about community housing and get away from that welfare model housing to greatest disadvantage. Now, that's not to say that we should stop housing the greatest disadvantage. I don't want to do that. Nobody would want to do that. We have to still do that, but I think there's a role for a parallel model alongside housing the disadvantaged. Part of the problem is in our eligibility system. We set the eligibility targets low because that's what we think the role of a social housing system is. Now, getting an adequate funding stream when you take in only low-income households is very difficult. But what if you recast the eligibility, as we did in the National Rental Affordability Scheme, and you start taking in moderate income housing groups? You can then service the finance to enable the growth of the system to provide affordable housing, not a welfare housing. And so I think the sector's got to be more organised about how we demonstrate that we can do that and put the case for it. Secondly, we have to highlight the economic and social benefits provided by community housing. Ken said they're very skilled at meeting with Treasury. Therefore, I have to acknowledge my weakness. I've had a number of meetings with Treasury and I've had some failures, one of which is the belief, which we have to overcome, that there is not an affordability problem. People are paying the rents, people are paying for the houses, therefore there can't be an affordability problem. That's how some people in Treasury think. But the second one is, what's the advantages? Why should we fund social housing? What are the advantages to social housing, to our economy? And that's the challenge for us. And I think we as researchers to date have not been able to demonstrate the economic advantages of social housing. We can all say, look, it's assisting disadvantaged people out of homelessness. But I actually don't think that's a good enough argument. That's a moral argument where treasuries are convinced by arguments about economic productivity and economic growth. And we have to actually fall into that sort of language and convince them that there are major economic advantages, productivity advantages in providing people with social housing. And that means, and it's probably amongst some of the people in this room, of capturing your stories. What difference did social housing make to your lives? Did it increase your ability to participate in the workforce? Did it increase your employment opportunity, your educational opportunities? Did it prevent marital breakdown or family dissolution? Did it reduce your health costs? We've got to work harder at demonstrating that these sorts of benefits have economic advantage and will reduce the other costs to government. So while it might cost more to commit to funding social housing, it will be matched by savings on the other side of human service delivery. Finally, amongst my short list, there are others, but this is a short list, we have to demonstrate we're capable of coming up with innovative ideas around land use, property development and finances. And that's back to, I think, one of the things that Haven has done particularly well. But I think the community sector as a whole has got to be able to demonstrate that we can do that, and that we can network and partner with state, local governments, private builders, developers, finance companies, and, because I know there's some here, property lawyers, in creating innovation around building the social housing sector. So that's more or less captured the flavour of what I wanted to say. There's, I've probably ignored some of the challenges. I've probably understated the opportunities, or overstated some of the opportunities, but it captures the flavour of what I wanted to say. So thank you, Ken, and all the best for the future of Haven Housing. Thank you.